So I think it's so interesting because we, like you said, just to reiterate what you said, we feel like we understand grief. Obviously, I don't understand someone else's grief personally, but I understand there are the seven stages, or I understand like it's normal to feel this way when you grieve the loss of a person, you grieve the loss of a job, you grieve the loss of a pet, you grieve the loss of something tangible.
Mhm.
But the social impact grief is lingering, and like you said, there's not necessarily going to be closure. It could just
Mhm.
like a thousand death by a thousand cuts almost sometimes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so now you can go into the framework, like how do we navigate this?
Yes. So as we get into this framework, I want to also share, because you mentioned the stages of grief. So many of us are familiar with like the typical stages of grief, like anger, denial, and so on,
Bargaining.
right? Acceptance, bargaining. Those stages of grief are, I think many of us have taken them to be sort of the only forms of grief, or the only sort of
Right.
phases of grief, if you will. And we've taken them to mean that it's a linear process. And that's not actually the case. So the person who
Yes.
defined these stages, the intention wasn't to say these are the only ways that the grief shows up,
Just to
or that
help
these are
someone.
sort of the steps you
Yeah.
follow. It's sort of is an attempt to really describe sort of commonalities in our grief experience, right? And so this is important because there isn't a prescribed timeline for how you grieve. There isn't a right or wrong way for how you express, right? There isn't a prescribed linear process where you have to go from bargaining to acceptance. Like that's not how grief works. So for many of us, it's very messy, and it's less of sort of a linear line from one step to the next. To one day you're feeling okay, to the next moment something triggers you and you're in tears, right? Or you're going into a funk, right? Um, so it looks differently for each of us. And I think what we get to do is we get to acknowledge that and to honor that, which actually brings me to the first part of this framework. So the framework is called ACE, ACE, and ACE stands for acknowledge, confront, and execute, right? So the A, acknowledgement, is simply about acknowledging the truth about where you are in the grieving process. Again, there's no right or wrong way. There's no timeline. There's no prescribed order of steps. And simply just acknowledging where you are. And there's some practical ways that you can do this. For some people, maybe it's through journaling. Maybe it's through talking out loud with a friend, therapy, support groups. Maybe there are mindfulness practices. Again, this is another place where there isn't a right or wrong way to do this, but it's simply without judging yourself or someone else, without even trying to change anything or take action. You're simply acknowledging where you are in your grief journey, right? And so, Julia, you've already done that, right? And I think there was a Tracy in the chat that talked about feeling this way for many, many years, right?
Yeah.
That is simply stating that, right? Simply writing that is doing this first part of this process, which is acknowledgement, right? The second step, the C, is about confrontation or confronting. And it's about really saying, okay, well, yes, I'm grieving. Here's the step I'm at. Here's the stage I'm at right now in this moment in this grieving process.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I need right now, right? What resources or people do I have to support me right now?
Mm-hmm.
What's in my control to do despite how I'm feeling right now in this moment? And so one of the important things about this is that our thoughts and our feelings, the sensations that we have in our body, which is how grief sort of manifests and shows up, right, for us, those things don't necessarily go away on their own before you can begin to take action, right? You can begin to take action. You can begin to move onward with life, even as you are holding space for the feelings and the thoughts and the very real raw emotions that you're holding on to. So this final step, the E, the execution, this is about taking constructive action, right? And so in the workplace context, when we talk about collective grief, this might mean acknowledging where you are, acknowledging that you have resources and support, and then going that step further to actually reach out to HR and say, hey, what's the latest on our mental health benefits, right? Do we have grief counseling available through our EAP program? Is there a support group through an ERG or an employee resource group that we have? Do I have access to a spiritual community, for example? Do I have access to be a part of a community like what we're creating right now, sort of in the moment, to be able to just simply share, hey, I have this same experience, right? I am not alone in this, right? Part of our experience sometimes is exacerbated because we feel like we are alone, right? And that's not the truth, right? The truth is that we are resourced, that we are in community, that we're doing this together, and we get to acknowledge the sort of the beautiful struggle of being in pain, but also working together to figure out how do we transmute or transform that pain into something beautiful.